All right, you're on candid camera.
Behave yourself.
Yeah, gotta behave yourself. This second class is always my favorite class because this is a class you'll never get in your college. Or if you do, I want to report. You need to report back to me if you take a college class and actually get this, because I have no clue how you can teach anything in ancient literature or ancient about. How can you teach anything at all without proving your sources? I mean, I guess you can make it all up, right? Yep. Which I think they do. But you know, I just make it up, right? But how can you go and teach about ancient documents or archaeology or even science, right? At least in science, you look back in the back, or you have papers, and even then, sometimes I think I saw a current article about the 10 greatest hoaxes in science, and there have been hoaxes. So the point is, I think we always need to prove the veracity of what we are doing, what we are studying, because otherwise, if it has no veracity, why bother? I mean, you might as well learn the Bhagavad Gita or the maybe the book of the Quran, right? I mean, they have no historical validity at all. I mean, I have a class. I've never taught that class here, but I've taught the class in other places about the historical validity of other documents in history, and I guarantee you none of them even come close. But we'll see that ourselves, because this is, like I said, one of the most important classes I think where we examine the veracity of the text we're going to study. And of course, we're examining Hebrews, and that's what we'll look at. And I'm going to go over, first off, I want to go over the words of the day. And by the way, did anyone figure this out yet? Oh, it's just Greek. Come on. And I'll even give it to you. See, P-R-O-S, pros, and this is in H-E-B-R-A-I-O-U-S. Hebraeus, pros Hebraeus. If you want simplified to the Hebrews. This is what, now, okay, I mentioned this before about LXX. How many titles are placed on ancient literature? Good answer, 0. Because, for example, do you think Paul, or no, do you think do you think Paul, when he wrote the letter to the Corinthians, at the top wrote, the letter to the Corinthians, or the first letter to the Corinthians, right? No, he just wrote to the Corinthians, or whatever. If you go look in the preface, whatever he said, right? And on the back, by the way, if it was a scroll, on the other side, he wrote, from Paul to the Corinthians, or to Corinth, or to the church of Corinth, or whatever he wrote, right? The ecclesia at Corinth. So, whenever we see a document in the ancient world, and that's, by the way, remember I mentioned last time about LXX, where did all the Psalms of David come from? They're not in the Hebrew. They're added in LXX, and that's where you find them. So, it gets touchy, right? When someone tries to make a theological appeal or a historical appeal. Now, theologically, you can believe anything you want, right? The spaghetti monster God, right? I mean, really, theologically, you can believe anything you want. That's come out. But if you have historical fact to back you up, then what are you believing? Truth or fact? Truth, yeah. So, what we want to talk about today is truth, and that's what these words are here. So, the words A-L-E-T-H-E-I-A-S, Aletheus, I think, see, I got it right here, yeah. Aletheus, this is the Greek word, actually, this is not false. In Greek, there is no word for truth. Because, why is there no Greek word for truth?
I wouldn't have thought they needed it.
Well, it gets simpler than that. The reason is, if you remember in geometry, does anybody remember back to geometry? Please, somebody tell me yes.
Proof.
Pretty fun.
Right, when you did proofs, what could you prove, what could you prove? The first thing your geometry teacher told you, I can't prove a true. I can't prove a plus. I can prove a not true. Okay? This is the first thing they teach you in geometry. And so in geometry, your whole life is proving a not true. And the point is, you set up your proposition, you set up your logical proof such that you're proving a not true. That's the way it works. So remember, the Greeks are a geometrically, what's a good word? They're a geometrically thinking culture. They're a culture that thinks concretely and geometrically. And so therefore, they don't need a word, they don't have a word for truth because you can't prove it. Yeah.
So when they say not false, do they say not false yet because nothing has proved it false? That it could at some point be true, or?
No, because remember when you did geometric proofs in geometry, could you prove beyond a shadow of a doubt a geometric proof? Yeah, you can. Guys, you can. Look, this is something that you've lost. You've lost this. This is so important. Think back to what, 7th, 8th grade? When did we study geometry?
10th grade.
Way back. This is probably one of the most important things that you could have learned in your middle school, your whatever you took in high school, because this is something of incredible importance. Because all those idiots that tell you, oh, you can't prove truth. You can't prove something, right? Have you heard this before?
That in and of itself is an absolute statement, however. So they're self-contradictory.
You see, there's someone who listened and remembered their geometry. Look, the Greeks are into geometry, and the Greeks know beyond a shadow of doubt that you can prove certain things true and false. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This is a word, amen. Okay? That is a Hebraic. It comes from Hebrew. And the reason that we need it is because in Hebrew, there is no word for truth either. But amen means,
That you agree.
yeah, I agree, but it's a much stronger than agree. It's more of the sense of,
Yeah, that's right.
It is so.
it is so. It's a self-validation. Now the problem is it's a self-validation, right? Because you see, I can't prove a true, but I can prove a not false. So a self-validation means what? You have agreed with the not true, that the other part of it, the true, is a truth, which is a difficult thing. Okay, I know, it's going to hurt your brain, right? But geometry hurt your brain, right? So that's okay. A-L-E-T-A-O-S. Alethos, which is truly. Now this comes from Greek, but it means truly. And the reason I put aletheos means not false. Alethos means not false. However, we have a problem. Remember when Jesus says, verily, verily, I say unto you? Okay, he is saying, alethos, alethos. And this is true throughout the Gospels. So Jesus is basically saying, not truly, truly. He's saying not true, not true. He's making a Greek affirmation of truth. And this is really important because Jesus is a Greek thinker. So it's very interesting. We're not going to be talking much about Jesus in the sense of, the Gospels, but if you go back and look at the Gospel, I think it's really important to note this. You don't see Jesus saying a lot of amens, although he does say amen a few times. In general, Jesus is saying, verily, well, look through your Bible. Verily, verily, I say unto you, right? He's telling them a Greek argument. In fact, he's giving them the telos, the conclusion, which is something that Greeks never do. And we always look for, but we never see, right? I love these words. These are really interesting words. Biblia and Membranas, membranous. The reason they're so important is because to us, by the way, our Bibles tell us very interesting translations. You usually find them translated the same all over the place. A biblia is a set of papyrus that have been collected together. And we're going to talk about biblia today. A membranous is a piece of vellum that has been written on, usually a vellum scroll. A papyrus, a biblia can be a scroll. Back in the old days, before books are called codexes. Before codexes, we had scrolls. What do we have before scrolls? Rocks, tablets. Well, this is very interesting. Here's a piece of great information. Tablets came from, here's the Levant and here's Egypt, right? And tablets came from this part, and papyrus came from this part. When everybody found papyrus, what did they say? We love it because your briefcase is a lot lighter, right? Nobody wants tablets. The reason they got tablets up in this area is because they had lots of dirt. Down here they had papyrus because they had papyrus, and they can make, great paper out of it. But nobody wanted it. The thing is that when we had papyrus, before scrolls, when they had both papyrus and tablets, the way they put together books, scrolls, right? Everything is books to us, is they would put the tablets, they would stack them. In fact, you'll see them in Elba. You see the tablets usually stacked this way. You don't stack them on top of each other because of
Earthquakes, they fall over.
well, no breakage, because they squish each other, because they're just made out of clay, right? So, and they didn't have very good firing techniques, and plus all of it wasn't fired. So you stacked yours like this. Now, what did you do with papyrus? You did what? You
Rolled it in.
no, you didn't roll it. Originally, they would put it in cubbies or in boxes. Okay, so a book would be a box. Now the problem with it is the minute your slave dropped the box, because they hadn't invented numbers, right? There's no punctuation, there's no continuous spelling, no punctuation, no capitals. So how do you know which page goes where? And remember, you can't read, it's all memorized, right? So now, how difficult do you think is putting stuff back together? So some smart guy got this idea, let's attach them. And they made scrolls. Using membranous is vellum, and biblia are papyrus, but they could be individual papyrus sheets or the tablets, right? And that was the problem with tablets. Now the other problem with tablets is how do you connect tablets together? It's hard to roll them up. So tablets went out of favor very quickly, especially for books and stuff. But today we have books and electronic books, right? So, these are, this is historic. We're looking into the ancient world, right? We're seeing the ancient world. So think in terms of the ancient world. Yes, ma'am?
I'm just wondering if you know, what kind of a collection did they have at the temple? Did they have all of the books?
Of the Bible,
Yeah.
you mean? Generally, you will not find, and you probably could not find, you may or may not find the books of the Bible, the membranous of the scrolls at the temple. Because the temple was for what? Sacrifice. As a matter of fact, I know we have this impression of the temple, that you pray at the temple. But you didn't pray at the temple. You did one thing at the temple. You brought your sacrifices to God. Now, prayers might be part of your sacrifices, but remember, when what's his name's mother? Samuel's mother went to pray at the temple for a child. What did they think?
She thought she was drunk.
She's drunk. Because at the temple was not where you pray. Now, she didn't have much option, because they didn't have the what then? Synagogues. The synagogues are where you went to learn, you went to pray, you went to worship when you didn't sacrifice. So, it's kind of an important thing. Now, I know that we see prayer in the temple, we see worship going on in the temple. Why do you think that started? Who caused that?
Destruction of the temple.
Well, it was those pesky teen hodos.
Yeah.
What did teen hodos do? They went to the temple daily. Why?
Give thanks.
How did you give thanks?
Sacrifice.
You sacrifice. They went to the temple daily to sacrifice because they thought Jesus' coming was imminent. And so the Thanksgiving sacrifice is what we call the Eucharist today. And so they were going for the Thanksgiving sacrifice, which they did every day. That's the reason they didn't have any money. That's the reason they were going broke, is because they were sacrificing every day, and they went to the temple courts to share the word, share, right, their faith, share the word. They were acting out their faith in their lives right there, see? And so the reason that in Christianity we get the impression the temple is a place of prayer and worship and, you know, the biblical books is because of that thing. But in general, if you were a Jewish person, you went to the synagogue. And even today, that's your only option, right? You can't go anywhere else except, we'll get into that, Alexandria. Mm-hmm. Well, and also there's an Essene issue we'll talk about. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, but when Jesus was 12 and he went to the temple for the festival with his parents, they couldn't find him for 3 days. He was at the temple with the scholars.
Yes.
And they were amazed at him. So something was going on besides sacrificing.
Well, let's remember this.
Probably right outside of it.
All the documents were they were memorized.
Right.
And so, number one, well, we'll do a quick digression on Jesus and his knowledge. All right. Every boy who was 12 years old knew the Torah and memorized the Torah. What had they not memorized yet? The Tanakh, the rest of the works, the prophets and the Psalms and the other pieces. So, and the other part that was memorized was the Mishnah and the Talmud. Now, memorizing the Mishnah and the Talmud is a work of 50 years. After your 50 years, that's why a Jewish scholar can't be a Jewish scholar until he's memorized all of that. See? Now, the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't care if you knew anything about the Mishnah and the Talmud. They didn't even agree with it, right? So the Sadducees were the temple priests, the Levites. They would have been impressed that Jesus knew the Tanakh, that he memorized everything. Do you have to have scrolls with you if you've got it memorized?
No.
Nope. And the biggest thing that would have impressed them isn't that so much. I suspect there were probably some Pharisees in the crowd, because the thing that would really impress them isn't that you knew all the Tanakh and all the other documents. The thing that would impress them is that you knew the Talmud and the Talmudic arguments. Because if you provided Talmudic arguments, that would have impressed them. So the impression of Jesus. Now, what were they doing? Well, that's where the priest could be found when they went to do their yearly work. You know, they were chosen by lot yearly, but yearly the Levites and the Aaronic priests went to do their work in the temple. So they went to the temple. So where did you find them? In the temple. That's where they set them up. And so that's where you'd find those people, right? Those leaders, those scholars. That's why Jesus was in the temple. And they all, they had places in the temple that they obviously, well, that's where they ate. Or remember, they ate because they would eat part of the sacrificial meals there. And they had to be purified with truma, right? The truma purification. Anyway, it's huge stuff in here. I mean, it's huge historical information here. And it's doesn't necessarily cast a different light on what we know. It's just the world is different than we expect it to be, right? We expect a library of that like this, right? And all these guys sitting around on chairs, right, around a table, right? No tables, no chairs, sitting on the floor, in the dirt maybe, right? On a mat or rug. That's a big deal, right? Remember I told you that there's a word in Greek for a room that has stuff in it. But they might have had 7 scrolls. The synagogue's where you have the scrolls. And by the way,
But they didn't have the full set, probably.
You're right.
They were so expensive.
most synagogues probably never had a full set. Matter of fact, the whole deal of a synagogue, it's kind of like, you know how a church saves up its money for its chalices and stuff in Christianity? They were saving up their money for a scroll of Ruth. If we could only, we've got all the Torah scrolls. If we could only get a scroll of Ruth, then we could read the scroll of Ruth at, not Purim, but at the Pentecost, one after Pentecost, right? I think it's the one after Pentecost, at the loaves, at the bringing of the law, right? Maybe it is Pentecost. Anyway, you know what I'm saying? And if we could get a scroll of Esther, then we could read it at Purim, you see? That's their thinking in the ancient world. Now today, we have our books. I mean, I've got at least the worth of 40 acre farms, right? Right here. It's not worth anything to us like that at all. But it was to them. It was so valuable, see? And that's what we'll talk about. Well, I don't mean to get off this subject, but anyway. Hey, let's look at the veracity of Hebrews. And what I'll do is I'll start with this. So this will just, I don't think I've gone over this per se many times. We'll talk about the bibliographical tests, internal, external tests. There are approximately 779 Greek manuscripts of, why does it say Mark? It should say Hebrews. That's weird. Wait. Yeah, it should say Hebrews. 779, that's the correct number of Hebrews. It's a primary source document. It was written, and this is correct, most scholars put this from 64 to 95 AD, but as we talked about last week, it's probably before 70 AD. As a matter of fact, the primacy of the sacrificial, the way they talk about the sacrifice is in the present tense in the Greek. So the sacrificial process has to be going on. So late date scholars have got to be wrong unless we're talking about Alexandria. Okay? So I'm not sure the late date scholars put it together the way they should, but if they are talking about late date for Hebrews, it's got to be Alexandria that we're talking about. But in any case, the temple's gone by 70 AD, so the Hebrews is most likely prior to 70 AD. We'll talk more about this. There are 40 Old Testament quotes or Old Testament allusions. There's 38 apocryphal allusions. The mysterion is mentioned 0 times, but there's a lot of mysterion speak in this document. The ecclesia is mentioned 1 time in chapter 12. It was written to Hebrews who spoke Greek, who performed Torah sacrifices. That is critical. There's only, okay, I'll grant you there is one other place it could be going on. And that other place, anybody want to venture? I kind of mentioned it. Jerusalem, 70 AD, gone. Alexandria is still there, and the other place is in the Galilee because the Essenes did sacrifices. We don't know exactly where, but we know they did. And so it could have been 2 Essenes. We'll see if there's any evidence of that. I'm not sure there's any evidence in Hebrews it was 2 Essenes. One of the big problems of writing to the Essenes is, what do you think? If you're going to write to the Essenes, what are you going to do? They wrote a lot of their documents in Greek, but guess what they didn't like? They're anti-Greek. They're anti-Hellenists. The Essenes are big-time anti-Hellenists because and a lot of their writing is in Aramaic. So they did write in Greek. They wrote in Greek to be understood. If you didn't write in Greek, it's kind of like, if I'm writing in Creole and I send you a letter in Creole, what are you going to do with it?
Translate it.
Well, maybe. Google Translate. You're going to toss it in the garbage because you can't understand it. So to be understood, the Essenes wrote a lot of stuff in Greek, but they did not like Greek. They were big time in Aramaic. So if you're writing to the Essenes, you're probably going to write in Aramaic, or at least in something that's closer to what they like. This is written in very high-level Greek. So high-level Greek would probably, it's already pointing us in the right direction. Look at this little, and also I want to mention Apostolic Fathers. Origen is about 96 AD. He was right in the 1st century. Tertullian is about, let's see, 150 to about 220 something. And then, let's see, did I get this right? And then Erasmus, did I get that right? Is that the other guy? Or Dionysian? Anyway, the other guy that I mentioned last week, I just wanted to give you kind of a circuit. He was about 150-ish, kind of in that period. So just so you get kind of an idea, general idea. So these were quoted by the Apostolic Fathers. And then if you look, here's the comparison, documental comparison, and we'll talk about this. This is what I want to really get into. And then I gave you a little bit of, Clement. Let's see, Clement, not Origen. This is Origen. This is Origen. This is Clement, and this is Origen. Boy, trying to keep these guys straight. I should make a timeline. That's what I need to do. Let's talk about documents. Let's see. All right. The important thing to note is this: when we talk about Hebrews, Hebrews is always found with Pauline letters. So when you find a collection of the Pauline letters in ancient documents, and the earliest one we have, just to give you, is around 200, circa 200 AD is the Pauline Codex. Codex is a book. And in it we have all the Pauline letters, including Hebrews. And Hebrews is always in that. The thing is that whether Paul or Apollos, or I think Apollos wrote it, we're going to look for more evidence of that, but whoever you think wrote it, by the time the Pauline letters were put together, Hebrews fit within it. Now, if Apollos is a really good friend of Paul's, guess what happened? All right, now I need to go through how, and I still have all the things I want to talk about. Let's talk about books in the ancient world. I know you've heard this from me before, but for those who are new or need a refresher, in the ancient world, no one wrote their own letters. No one wrote their own letters. Period. Done. What you did is when you wanted to write a letter, you called for a Libraeus. The Libraeus would come. Libraeus is a word used many times in the New Testament. The Libraeus would come to your house, and he would bring biblia, he'd bring pieces of papyrus, and he would bring membranus, pieces of vellum. And he would bring all kinds of different types of inks. The quality of ink was very important. And so, you know how a piece of paper costs like, what, less than a penny? A single piece of paper, remember, a written papyrus scroll, a written scroll in the ancient world is worth the amount of a 40-acre farm. So, out of that, what do you think the cost of the materials are?
1,000 hours of labor.
Matter of fact, okay, when you give me a piece of paper, do you count the hours it took you to write that piece of paper? Do you count the hours it took you to learn to read and write? No. When you give me a piece of paper, you consider the letters and the cost of the letters to be zero. But the value of the paper is important. So a 40-acre farm means the construction materials are worth at least that, and the cost of the Libraeus. So let's say that cost is about half. So the cost of materials are about the cost of a 20-acre farm. That's pretty expensive. The Libraeus brings this material to you and he says, okay, are you cheap today? Do you want a vellum? Vellum's expensive. Or do you want papyrus? Papyrus is cheap. Do you want, well, relatively cheap. It's only a 10-acre farm. Do you want, okay, a expensive ink, the India ink that comes from India? Or do you want the mollusk ink that basically, is nearly kind of a purplish color and costs like lots? Or do you want the really cheap stuff that I squished from some elderberries? Right? With my own bare feet. I give you a break. It's only like 1 acre. So the guy would give you the choices and you'd start. And so you would recite to him what you wanted to write. and he would write it down. Then he would go through a correction process. So he would correct the writing. Remember, no spaces, no vowels, well, vowels in Greek, no spaces, no caps, no punctuation, no chapter marks, no verses, nothing, no sentences. It's just all run on. And so he then you correct it with him. Once it's corrected, now he makes 3 copies. One copy he saves, one copy he gives to you, and the other copy is sent on its way to the letter. It's the letter. And with that copy goes a slave or a deliverer. Okay, usually you wanted to send slaves. Why?
Well, they may cost extra. You're a slave.
It's cheap, yeah. And if the slave gets croaked on the road, you know, I mean, like, okay, Paul says, hey, Timothy, I want you to take a letter for me. And Timothy goes, huh? Me? You know, do you think I want to go? You know, I mean, what do you need? Because with a slave, how many people do you send? One. But if you send Timothy, what do you need to send? A little entourage here, right? A couple of slaves, somebody to protect them, somebody to carry the money. I mean, this is the way the world worked in the ancient world. So, you know, you'd usually send a slave. The slave would memorize the text. Now do you see the cost in this stuff?
What happens if the slave gets croaked?
Well,
Labreus have insurance?
Another 2 acres.
this is really cool, because whenever you send a letter, you always got return receipt.
COD.
Because the slave always wanted to,
Oh.
he always wanted to come back for dinner. I mean, if you're a slave, where else are you going to go? I mean, you don't have very many options. I mean, it's the ancient world. So, I mean, okay, I hate to describe for you. What do you think slaves wore? If you read my book, The Second Mission, I think I made a great point of trying to describe for you what slaves wore, how they looked. I mean, you know, we're all finely groomed. What do you think a slave looked like?
Kind of stood out.
Naked.
Yeah, mostly naked, not well washed, not well cleaned, probably stunk. You know, his master probably said, take a bath, jump in the lake, right? You know, maybe that's where jump in the lake came from. In any,
That's your language.
but what they would do is they would go and they would return to their master, return to the place of origin. That was your return receipt. That's the way you know the message got through. And, you know, also, well, you probably got complaints too. What if your slave went and misread or read poorly?
Stuttered.
How much literacy did the slave have?
The slave would have great literacy. Remember, Plato was originally a book slave. He was a scroll slave. His purpose was exactly what I'm talking about. He would be in the marketplace, and when somebody stole the scroll, Plato would go with him to have the text memorized. Plato was originally a scroll slave. And so that should show you some huge ramifications in the world.
But sometimes they were going long distances, were they not? It wasn't just across town. They would, because when Paul wrote to the Romans, he wasn't in Rome, he was someplace else. And so that was probably a great distance for someone to travel with the scroll.
And, you know, early Christians, probably if you're going to send a letter to Rome, you probably want to send it with someone who's going to Rome, right?
Right.
However, okay, think about this. Think about this. Okay, I want to send a letter to the Romans, right? And I want to send it with whoever, Timothy, I don't care, Origin. Send it with Clement, right? And so you hand Clement this scroll, and you say, I want you to deliver us. What does that mean you have to do if you're Clement?
You have to memorize it.
You have to memorize it. Now, if you really want to memorize it, that's cool. What do you think most people in the ancient world wanted to do? Other things. I mean, it's like you want to go bowling, right? You want to go fishing, right? You want to go to church. I mean, you do anything except memorize a book, right?
10 letters to deliver.
So, yeah, exactly. So what you would do is, even if Clement went, he would probably take a slave with him, and that would save the cost of a lot of things. Plus, plus, who's paying for it?
The other guy, hopefully.
Yeah, the other guy. You know, I mean, think about the cost. I mean, there's huge costs involved. We wonder why there's so little ancient literature, right? There are huge costs involved with even sending a letter. It's amazing, the British postal system, you could get, a penny black would send a letter across the world, right? And you could write it yourself. We'd gotten out of the era of writing, slaves and libres. Did that answer the question? I mean,
Well, kind of, sort of. I'm still confused about if it was all memorized anyway, what's the whole point of sending the scroll?
because the memorization is because the scroll was the mnemonics. And so you wanted to make sure that your words were perfect. So it was like,
Does the recipient read it?
Well, the recipient.
it was read to the
I
recipient.
understand.
And then the recipient would either memorize it themselves, have a slave trained, or others would memorize it. Like, for example, if I sent it to the Romans, people in the ancient world were used to memorizing books,
Right.
even the wealthy and literate. So, usually they let their slaves do it, right? Recite to me the scroll of Romans. And so their slaves, they would keep, if they were wealthy. But a lot of people they were sending it to weren't necessarily wealthy. But the way it was read in the church is the pastor or some person, in the Hebrew church or the Hebrew synagogues, there are people that are the lectors who read Hebrew. They have memorized the Hebrew. They take the Hebrew scrolls, and to ensure they don't read wrongly, as a matter of fact, when you read in a synagogue, there are 3 people for every reading. There are 2 lectors, and there is the reader. The reader has a stylus. He puts it under the letters. The letters are not separated. There are no vowels. And the lectors make sure that the reader reads it correctly. That's the way it's done. I suspect, what do you want to bet that the early Christian churches did the exact same thing? They had people that had memorized it, and they had checkers to make sure it was read correctly.
Now, when you say memorization, it's not the guy sat down and read through it and committed everything to memory. He was remembering how to read it, and the separations of the words and the inflections that were put on it.
Yes.
But he wasn't memorizing the whole Bible, every single word, that he could just sit down with his eyes closed and...
That's why they invented the mnemonics. We fix the inflections and stuff by putting in punctuation. Even then, you can add a whole lot. If I read a text to you, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son.
Question
right?
mark.
God so loved the world he gave his only begotten son. If you add your own inflection to it, the inflection is assumed in English by the punctuation. But even then, you might not get it right. The thing is that when it was read, you're exactly correct. They did the inflection, they did everything, and that's why when they hold the stylus below the text in a synagogue, they're getting every letter. They're making sure that every mnemonic is correctly done. So, how do you prove truth? This is what I want to go into. So, we have the Greeks invented 3 ways to prove truth. Let's see if I got a darker. I think I got a darker blue one. Anybody want to remember the 3 ways to know truth? Yeah, historical, legal. And I want to make sure that you know this is not a theological method. There is what's that theological method that is not a good one? I don't do theology, so I never memorize this. Sometimes I have it in my notes, sometimes not. Anyway, there's a theological method that has a lot of great disrepute that has a similar name.
Historical critical?
Yeah, historical critical. I think that's right. So when we say historical legal, this is not a method of theological interpretation.
That's our judicial system, isn't it?
This is judicial system, exactly. What's the other method?
Scientific.
Scientific method. These are methods. And you know what the last one is? Logic. I usually don't teach logic. I'm not going to touch much logic. But, okay, scientific method. I set up a hypothesis. I test.
Repeatable.
It's got to be repeatable.
Repeatable test, record data.
Repeatable. You mean it's got to be repeatable? So I can't prove the beginning of the universe. Unless it starts many times, right? If it's not repeatable, you can you use the scientific method?
No.
It's got to be repeatable. It has to be repeatable. The Greeks are very clear on this. The scientific method's very clear on this. If you can't repeat it, it can't be proven with a scientific method. So therefore, what method must I use? No. I have to use the historical legal method. The historical legal method is a method used to prove things that only occur one time. What? Well, it gives it away in the name. What is most events that are proven historical legal are historical. Like, what did you eat this morning? I guess I can rip your stomach open and examine the contents. But the best way to do it is if you kept a diary and wrote down, I ate this. Or if I went to your house and I looked at the plates you had, that you hadn't cleaned, or even if you cleaned them, maybe I could get some,
Trace DNA.
trace information off of it, right?
In the trash.
Yeah. Historical legal method is what we're talking about. So if we examine, okay, people say all the time, well, you can't prove the Bible with science, right?
That's true.
Well, duh. I mean, is that a misrepresentation or what? I mean, that's like idiocy. Can I prove that Lincoln lived with a scientific method?
No.
No. I can't prove anything with a scientific method that is not repeatable. Maybe I can't prove that he's even Abraham Lincoln even if I had DNA, right? It don't work that way. So you have to use the historical legal method. So if we apply the historical legal method to, for example, the books of the New Testament, the books of the Old Testament, we're talking specifically about the book of Hebrews. So let's look at the book of Hebrews. That's how we prove history. And I'm kind of, we've already been through this before, so I'm not trying to short you, but I'm just going to move ahead. Skip ahead, brother. So we use 3 criteria to judge historical veracity of text. We're talking about Hebrews, the text of Hebrews. So we want to prove the historical veracity. There's 3 tests. The 3 tests are the bibliographical test. We're talking about, I should have left that up. We're talking about historical legal, also called the evidentiary method. Evidence, the evidentiary method. So if I want to prove that a document is accurate or has veracity in the past, then what I do is I need to apply 3 tests. Bibliographical, internal, and external. Now, bibliographical has nothing to do with Bible. It has everything to do with the manuscripts. So the test of the bibliographical test, number one, when I look at bibliographical, we examine the number of manuscripts, and how close to the time. The closer it is to the time that the events occurred, the better the manuscript. So, for example, okay, let's say I wanted to write a book about the Civil War.
Printing press kind of sways that a bit.
No, not at all.
I can put out 10,000 copies of a digital in an instant.
Except a manuscript is not that.
That's the
A
point.
manuscript
There's the point.
is a handwritten document. All right, I guess I have to go over that too. We had the printing press around 14, what, 15, 14, say 1450, okay? Everything before that is a manuscript, handwritten manuscript. No manuscripts of any document in antiquity exists.
Original. That we know of.
No original.
That we know of.
We haven't found any yet. No originals from any documents. That means Plato, Socrates, Caesar, all those guys. No documents exist in antiquity. The earliest documents we have, and usually this is the year, and anybody want to know why 680 AD is considered the great year for antiquity?
Because we have primary sources from that date forward.
We do. And anyone know what the specific primary source document we have?
Would it be the Dead Sea?
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Scrolls, that's the one that pops in my mind, is it?
The Quran. There is a copy of the Quran from that period. So we do have, I think it's 2 copies that we know of. And so generally these are considered documents in antiquity. And this is the point at which antiquity goes to the modern era. Because in the modern era, we do have some manuscripts of documents that are originals. That doesn't mean the veracity of the text is proven. That just means that we have manuscripts that are within the period, that between the writer and the written. The problem with the Quran is all the history in the Quran, is
False.
well, no. Don't even say it's false. That's not an applicable way to approach this from a historical standpoint. The problem with the Quran is all the history in the Quran is about Jesus.
If
That's
it's
the
borrowed,
latest.
It has some things from like the Old Testament, but they're a little different and.
Right. It's Jesus and before though.
Yeah.
Jesus is the latest guy that Muhammad talks about. So Jesus to the Quran is at least 650 years. So how did Muhammad know anything about Jesus or Abraham?
Second,
Revelation.
fourth, fifth.
He read it from the New Testament. Well, actually, he couldn't read. He couldn't read or write. So he basically got it, but that's where he got it. He made a trip to Jerusalem, and by the way, Jerusalem at the time was controlled by Christians. And when he went in there, he basically learned about the New Testament. That's where he learned about Jesus. So he was writing about stuff that 600-something years out. How good is that? That's the problem. You know, you say, well, it's false. The reason it's false is because and I'm going to bring in a new term here. This is part of the internal test, is primacy. Primacy. Primacy of document. Okay, if I saw it, that's a primary source. If I saw it and I wrote it down. Did Muhammad see it?
Nope.
Nope. So it's not a primary. A secondary source document is I interviewed somebody who saw it. Usually these are newspaper, like a newspaper reporter. A reporter comes to you and says, hey, did you see a Lincoln assassination? And you go, yeah, I saw it. This is what happened. He writes it down. That's a secondary source document. A tertiary source document is basically everything else. Tertiary source means you didn't see it. So basically the Quran is a tertiary source. Already, I'll skip ahead, brothers, because we don't have a lot of time. Hebrews is what kind of document? Primary, secondary, tertiary?
Secondary.
Is the writer, okay, we haven't looked at the, anybody read Hebrews yet? You guys need to read Hebrews, right? Read it. Does the writer of Hebrews write about things that are happening now and his ideas? No. He writes a letter to the Hebrews about what?
What happened? Current events.
Well, his ideas, his thoughts. It is a primary source document from the writer that includes some secondary and tertiary source information. Kind of like, this is something we'll look at ourselves, all right? This is where, this is what we look at veracity of source. So, for example, if I write a technical document, this is a great example. Let's say I write a technical document, an engineering document, and I quote another source. Is it a primary or a secondary document or a tertiary document?
The document is primary, you're writing it,
The document is primary.
but your sources are secondary or tertiary.
Right. Or the sources could be a primary source, right? Exactly.
Well, but they're not primary if you're writing it.
Unless it's
Right.
Their
scientific.
source was primary.
Unless it's
What
scientific,
I'm doing
which
is
repeatable.
this, okay, and here we go. Do I have to run into this? This is called a logical ethos. An ethos argument. Ethos means an argument using a source. So, for example, when the writer of Hebrews quotes the Psalms, they're using an ethos argument in logic to support their primary source statements. Exactly right. I know, we've gotten kind of more complex into this than we have before, which I think is really cool, because that means we're digging deeper into this. So, the number of manuscripts and the time between the manuscripts. So, let's look at this, okay? Usually I give you a lot of lists. I gave you a list of exactly that, right? So, the number of documents, let's see, where is that? The Pauline letters. This is including Pauline letters. The 779 Greek manuscripts of the Pauline letters. The latest extent is 200. There are some fragments from around 85 AD of some of the Pauline letters. The lapse of the events to writing, I said 2 to 10 years, but in the case of Hebrews, it's probably right and immediate. The lapse of the event to the manuscript is less than 200 years. If you count the fragments, it's way less than that. But let's just set within there. Now, the big deal here is let's compare this to other literature. That's what matters, right? So when you go to college and you read, for example, Catullus. Catullus is a famous Greek scholar, historian, from around 554 BC. The earliest copy of his manuscript is 1550 AD. Earliest copy. The time span from when he wrote about to the document is about 1600 years. The number of copies is pretty good in ancient. The average number of copies we have in ancient literature, how many do you think? One. The average number of copies we have is 1 point something. Catullus is a good one because we have 3. I've got my list here. I didn't give you the list this time. Pliny the Younger, 850 years. Time span 750 years between when he wrote in the events. 7 copies. These are all good ones. The Plato, Tetralogy, 7 copies, 1200 years. Euripides, 1500 years, 9 copies. Let's see, do I have, where's the one that's really good? I got my list. Ancient literature.
Lionel, while you're looking at it, when you say a copy,
Yeah.
how do you know that it was written at the time of the original?
Well, it wasn't. The copies that we have, for example, of Catullus.
Well, if I copy one right now, don't you have a copy?
Yeah, but that would be, the time between when you made that copy and Catullus, add another 1,000 years. Or so. So the thing is, okay, this is what happens with ancient literature. Okay, with ancient literature, I make a copy, probably on papyrus because it's cheap. Someone discovers after maybe 100 years that that's a valuable piece of document that I want to make another copy of.
They make one. But how do you know they made it a copy exactly like the original? How do you know that? The veracity of it.
That's the problem. Okay, so for Hebrews, there's 779 copies. So guess how many copies I have that I can compare?
779.
That's right.
You
And when
also
you,
have fragments.
and that's why, and here's the time to bring it up. Let's see, majority text. Okay, I have a majority text. You guys can read it if you want. It's all Greek to me too, because it's all Greek. But the majority text is 779 documents. The scholars have taken that and they boiled it down, and that's the majority text. And so it tells you when there's textual differences between the documents. The majority text, there are other texts that Bibles are translated from, but the majority text is the most important. By the way, what do you not find in the majority text? Or what do you find asterisked in the majority text? 2 of the favorite ones that non-Christians love to hit you with. Number 1, the lady caught in adultery. We don't even know what book it's in because it's not. It's not in the New Testament. People, the lady caught in adultery was added. It's a Gnostic document added to the New Testament. In the majority text, it's asterisk. In your Bible, it's asterisk. It is not in the original text. Period. Done. Flat out. The last verses of Mark, the last chapter of Mark, approximately, is not in the original. Period. We already studied that. We know that in Mark, this does not exist. They were added. Now, whether you want to accept the ads and use them, that's okay. But remember, what do they always sell by Christians? The snake biters, right? Those people that handle snakes and they believe that, you can drink poison, right? And they always, what do they do? Slap you with that. Well, it's not in the Bible. Tell them it's not in the Bible. What are you reading? I read the Greek. What are you reading? See? So the number of documents allows us to tell. Since we have 779 documents.
But again, you're going to come down to a probability of accuracy.
So what's the probability of accuracy with one?
Not very good.
Not very good. How about catalysts? Right? What about the best one? The best one we have 193 copies of Sophocles. These are historical documents. So Sophocles is pretty good. Right? Josephus. How many copies of Josephus we have? Anybody want to venture a guess?
3 or 4.
No, actually we have one. We actually have a few. There's about 75 copies of Josephus' Wars. But how does 75 compare to 779?
5%. Less than 10.
Now, Josephus, and that's what I was looking for, Josephus, when he wrote, let's see, the famous ones, Josephus, that they always teach you when you go to school. Josephus' War, Josephus' Antiquities. He was writing about stuff that happened 10 to 300 years before he lived, and Antiquities 3 to 300 years. How accurate do you think Josephus was?
Our nation wasn't even born.
Well, he wrote stuff that he never saw. Almost all of Josephus' writings about stuff he never saw. So guess what? When you go to college, what do they use when they teach about the first century period? Now, why would they teach Josephus and not the New Testament? Why don't they use the New Testament documents? Are they idiots?
Their
Oh.
universities are government funded, and they have to have separation of church and state.
Well, this isn't separated church state. This is just looking at the documents historically.
I'm talking about what leftists think.
Oh, what leftists think. Okay. Well, I thought leftists had to follow the historical test too.
Nah, not when they don't want
Okay, here's the ultimate problem. I'll give you a telos, okay? Here's the telos.
Religion.
The telos is this. If you don't know the historical legal method and can't apply the bibliographical process, the process of proving the veracity of a document in history, what good is your history? It's not worth the words that are spoken. So that is what your children are getting in the colleges. They are getting stuff from professors who have no clue what they're talking about. They're using bad sources, and they're not using the proper sources. And I'll go flat out and say that. So, although I didn't get a chance to go through all the stuff I usually talk about, I hope this was a good process of thinking about different things. But the ultimate that I want to leave you with is we can trust Hebrews. We'll look at deeper into Hebrews for the primary, secondary, tertiary sources and the document itself for logic, too. And I'll bring some logic in there as well. In any case, that's the point. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.